There once was a man who lived among mountains. All his life he dreamed and investigated dreams and legends. He studied other countries, other cultures, and other ages. He was a traveler, a scientist, and a scholar. His dreams have changed our ideas. His name was Carl Gustav Jung.
My dear friend, Dr. Jung, I receive your always welcome letter. Indeed, I am very glad to hear from you. What I told you the day we was top the roof, you understand me correct. And also, I will tell you more that you can write in that book.
For the traditional Indians, the mythology is part and parcel of their whole social system. They don't just believe in myths. The myth is their culture. Their way of life is their myth.
The Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung spent the early part of his working life investigating the personal unconscious through dreams. But he devoted the second half of his career to researching what he called the collective unconscious, which connected people of different cultures at the deeper level of dreams, ritual, religion, and mythology. The author, Count Nikolai Tolstoy.
It would be very hard to explain, it seems to me, for the universality of certain myths, which repeat themselves and sometimes or very often, in strikingly similar detail in very different cultures and societies. And I don't see how that could be explained unless there's something springing up, so to speak, from universally within men, which Jung gave this term, the collective unconscious.
The concept of the collective unconscious is absolutely essential for understanding Jung. I can't say it was his invention, but it was his discovery. The collective unconscious is that set of building blocks from which human reality is made. And it's as if there is this great reservoir outside of time and space, patterns or energy. Mankind struggles to give it definition like this, from which everything is drawn or everything is made.
Jung observed a lack of meaning in the lives of his patients and in modern European culture in general. He studied mythology, legends, fairy tales, and religions in many languages to see what they shared and what European culture lacked. In 1925, Jung set off to visit the Elgonyi tribe in Kenya. His companion was the English psychiatrist Godwin Baines, who had worked in Zurich as Jung's assistant. Together, he and Baines filmed their expedition in search of psychological discoveries. They trekked for weeks through the highlands of Kenya towards Mount Elgon. Their African destination was in extreme contrast from the Europe of the 1920s. Jung was fascinated by primitive societies in which mythology and ritual defined the role and meaning of the individual person's life. Jung was 50 and white-haired. The African tribesmen honored him with the title Mzi, or Old Man. They were as fascinated by the white European doctor as he was by them. He had learnt some Swahili, and as always, he asked everyone he met about their dreams and the importance they gave to dreaming. Dr. Joe Wheelwright.
His visit to Africa certainly helped to inform him on the subject of dreams and to differentiate between what he called big dreams and little dreams. And this had to do with whether the dream was from the collective unconscious, from the deepest layers, or whether it was from the personal unconscious. Because a big dream came from the collective unconscious and was really universal in its import.
Jung's expedition party spent 6 weeks living among the Elgonyi. In conversation with the elders of the tribe, Jung asked them about their religious practices and their dreams. In particular, the Swiss doctor of medicine conferred with the Laibon, or medicine man.
He answered with tears in his eyes. In old days, the Laibons had dreams and knew whether there is war or sickness, or whether rain comes, or whether herds should be driven. But since the whites were in Africa, he said, no one had dreams anymore. The divine voice which counseled the tribe was no longer needed, because the English know better. Our camp life proved to be one of the loveliest interludes in my life. I enjoyed the divine peace of a still primeval country. Never had I seen so clearly man and other animals. Thousands of miles lay between me and Europe, mother of all demons. In traveling to Africa to find a psychic observation post outside the sphere of the European, I unconsciously wanted to find that part of my personality which had become invisible under the influence and pressure of being European.
Jung's journey to Africa was his longest and most dramatic adventure into unknown psychic territory. The distance and the difference of cultural patterns gave him a sense of perspective on the civilized Western psyche. Jung had first visited the United States with Sigmund Freud in 1909. 3 years later, his reputation in America growing rapidly, Jung was invited to visit St. Elizabeth's in Washington, D.C., then, as now, the principal psychiatric hospital in the United States. He wanted to discover whether black patients there had the same sorts of dreams as white Europeans, a question no one had ever asked before. Unlike the men and women at St. Elizabeth's today, the patients of 75 years ago had never been asked about their dreams. When Jung talked to them, he found that the dreams, fantasies and artwork of Negro patients reminded him of his European patients' dreams, and that both contained ideas and images found in ancient mythology.
In all probability, the most important mythological motifs are common to all times and races. I have, in fact, been able to demonstrate a whole series of motifs from Greek mythology in the dreams and fantasies of purebred Negroes suffering from mental disorders.
Back in Switzerland, Jung put his observations to use in the work to which he always returned, that of healing the psyche.
Through my acquaintance with many Americans and my trips to and in America, I have obtained an enormous amount of insight into the European character. On my next trip to the United States, I went with a group of American friends to visit the Indians of New Mexico, the city-building pueblos.
Jung visited Taos Pueblo, the oldest settlement of the Pueblo Indians. The Pueblo tribe, like the Hopi, the Navajo and the Acoma, are one of the many tribes of the Anasazi culture, whose original homes are now ruins, like the White House in the Canyon de Chelly in eastern Arizona. These oldest inhabitants of North America are farming peoples, whose history, mythology, religion and calendar are all interwoven. Their tradition is one of living close to the earth and the elements, attuned to the seasons, related to their gods. For them, the earth is mother and the sun father. In 1923, Jung visited New Mexico and went with friends to Taos, anxious to know more. Dr. Joe Henderson.
He was very impressed by a medicine man he met there called Mountain Lake, and he always liked to repeat what Mountain Lake had said, that the Americans were all crazy because they think with their heads instead of with their hearts, the way the Indians do.
Mountain Lake shared with him the Indian religious view that their rituals help the sun to come up every day. and that without their help, the sun would stop coming up. And that piece of information and the meeting of a living embodiment, a representative of such a way of life, struck a very deep chord in Jung.
Mountain Lake was the English name of Oquia Biano, a Pueblo elder who talked to Jung about the tribal life of the Taos Indians in the 1920s and about their traditional religion. His granddaughter Martha Suazo still lives in Taos and has preserved the letters which Mountain Lake wrote to Jung later.
My grandfather was Oquia Biano, Blue Lake Mountain, and also known as Antonio Mirabal of the Taos Pueblo tribe. He was a member of the Taos Pueblo Council, and he lived here until he died.
My dear friend, Dr. Jung, many moons gone by since I hear from you. I've been thinking of you many times to write to you, but I lost your address.
You corresponded with a lot of people, and as a child, I was always over at his house, and I would see some of the letters that some of the people would write to him.
My dear friend, Mountain Lake, it was very nice of you indeed that you wrote a letter to me. I thought you had quite forgotten me. I often thought of you in the meantime, and I even talked of you often to my pupils. Are your young men still
Sometimes he would be sitting there. He had a big table. It was a dining table, but he used it for a desk, you know, and he had all his boxes of paper and whatever, you know, and he would be sitting there sometimes writing letters to people.
10 years after our religion is destroyed, the whole world will see that we have been working for the whole world. As I told you, our great Father, the Sun, is the one who supports the whole world. And that's our duties to help our great Father, the Sun.
I really don't know maybe to what depth he told Jung, but he made an impression on him, and Dr. Jung made an impression on my grandfather.
My old Pueblo friend thought that the raison d'etre of his Pueblo had been to help the sun to cross the sky. I envied him for the fullness of meaning in that belief.
That was my grandfather's philosophy, that if our Taos Pueblo Indians stopped practicing their religion, he said give or take 10 years that the whole world would end. After all, that's what's keeping this world going.
In 1963, Jung's grandson Dieter Baumann, also an analyst, followed in the footsteps of his grandfather to Taos to meet the elderly Indian who had had such an impact on Jung.
It was very moving because, 40 years before, my grandfather had met him, and he could remember very well and showed me that they had talked there on the roof with each other. And I found him a very fine man, a very special man. He was very intelligent, and he had a very soft face, also very human, profoundly human. I think he had a very deep feeling.
We do feel with the heart, or think with the heart.
See, Mountain Lake said, how cruel the whites look. Their lips are thin, their noses sharp, their faces furrowed and distorted by folds. Their eyes have a staring expression. They're always seeking something. What are they seeking? The whites always want something. They're always uneasy and restless. We do not know what they want. We do not understand. We think that they are mad. For the first time in my life, so it seemed to me, someone had drawn for me a picture of the real white man. This Indian had struck our vulnerable spot, unveiled a truth to which we are blind.
Indian religious rituals have two main forms: ritual dances to honor the gods and to assist in the successful progress of farming and harvesting, and chants by medicine men. A chant can last as long as 9 days and is used for healing both physical and psychological illness. In Taos, Jung witnessed ceremonial dances like the eagle dance. To the Pueblo Indians, the eagle and the buffalo are both sacred animals. Religious traditions dictate that eagle feathers must be used in ceremony and ritual, so the tribe thanks and honors the bird by imitation. Bauman also saw Indian rituals.
The main message from the Indians was, for me, the respect for the earth, the religious attitude towards the earth. They are really in touch with the spirit of the earth.
Lily Salvador is a traditional Indian potter in New Mexico.
That rock was left here for my mother by her mother. She had used it to grind either corn, or what I did was grind the pottery shards and our clay on there to make it real fine. The shards are from in the hills. When we take a hike, we find them and we bring them back because they're used back into our clay, used as a temper. So it's an old and a new pot put together.
What Jung and Bauman both encountered was a culture where religion, history, ritual and mythology are fully integrated.
The new clay is found at a secret place. Only the potters know where to get it, and there's no road to it, so we just have to carry it on our backs. I don't think if anybody else, like the Anglo or anybody else, if they learned how to form the pot, they won't have that feeling of the clay or just the touch of our ancestors there.
The pots themselves are not merely decorative. They tell the history of the Acoma tribe's search for their promised land, the high mesa of Acoma, known as Sky City, and claimed as the oldest inhabited settlement in the United States. The story of the long journey to the Acoma's tribal home is passed down the female line, and the potters are always women, who give the story expression in the traditional form.
The design here represents how our people had traveled a long time ago. It was told to us that they had traveled in a circle, always looking for a place that was ready for them. In our language, Acoma means a place that was ready, or the promised land. And the lines represent your rain. It rained on them, and right here is your sun, and it's coming out of the cloud here.
The myth of the Acoma people reflects the everyday reality of many of the Indian tribes. Wherever there is rain or water of any kind, there can be agriculture, food, and survival. But the tribe is not only at the mercy of the elements. Its traditions also bring the elements into harmony. Lily Salvador's pots require the clay earth and fire to set them hard, but they also need the life-giving water and air as well.
That's what we always have in mind, is moisture. After I finish making a pot, I'm told to blow into them to give them a heart or their own spirits. And down at the bottom, when we draw our first line, we are told not to close it completely, and that brings in the spirit. The spirits of my ancestors are there.
Jung's meeting with Indians was brief, but like his contact 2 years later with the African tribesmen, he encountered a society for whom mythology was the religious explanation of their life and origins, expressed in story and ritual. Jung was quite sure that man is not complete without a living mythology or religion. Unlike his European patients, tribal people had a sense of meaning to their lives.
Beano told him that through the ritual, every morning they made the sun come. If they didn't come, the sun wouldn't rise anymore, and it would be the end of the world. He realized that people had to live their own myths, and it was important to him that they were related to something important, they were related to something greater than themselves, and that is all that matters. He found similar instances with them and with others, and this made him believe in the all presence of the unconscious, the collective unconscious.
In his travels and studies, Jung saw mythologies as the expression of the collective unconscious. When stories, images or symbols appeared in similar form but in different cultures, he called them archetypes. These represent a common human inheritance of patterns of thought and action or basic psychological instincts.
It is quite certain that man is born with a certain functioning, a certain way of functioning, a certain pattern of behavior, and that is expressed in the form of archetypal images or archetypal forms. For instance, the way in which a man should behave is given by an archetype. Yeah. And therefore, you see, the primitives tell such stories. A great deal of education goes through storytelling.
He thought that scientific industrial man was suffered great psychic distress and frustration because the religious side of our nature was repressed. Jung was trying to speak to that, to bring it forward. According to the Jungian tradition, our religions are produced something like works of folk art. Religion is the heart and center of culture, and it's through religion that we work out a common vocabulary of rituals and symbols, which together makes up a kind of house of meaning that we dwell in, our particular vision of the universe, of human life, of human personal relations, and so on.
In Africa, Jung sat with the Elgoni men as they told their myths and stories.
For instance, they call in a palaver of the young men, and two older men perform before the eyes of the younger all the things they should not do. Yeah. And the answer say, no, that's exactly the thing you shall not do. Another way is they tell them of all the things they should not do. They not use like a decalogue. Thou shalt not. Yes, yes. And that is always supported by mythological tales. For instance, our ancestors have done so and so, and so you shall do. Or such a hero has done so and so, and that is your model. Yes. In Greek, you know, there was a Theseus, there was a Heracles, models of fine men, of gentlemen, you know. Yes, yes. And they teach us how to behave. They are archetypes. I see. Archetypes of behavior.
In his research and travel in Africa, America, and Britain, Jung absorbed mythological material, and above all images, to relate to his patients' dreams and the images of their unconscious. And everywhere he found evidence of the collective unconscious. author Robert Johnson.
He discovered it in the unconscious of his own patients and in his own extraordinary experiences of dreams and visions, and also in the mythology, which fascinated him. The fact that mythology from every part of the world carries so many elements in common fascinated him.
Well, there are certain myths that are timeless and universal, such as the hero myth, the trickster cycle which you find among the American Indians or among African natives or in Australia or anywhere. These are on a primitive tribal level, but they can be found in the dreams of modern people just as well. And they are found in the Far East as well as in the Christian West.
We think we are able to be born today and to live in no myth, without history. That is a disease. That's absolutely abnormal, because man is not born every day. He is once born in a specific historical setting with the specific historical qualities, and therefore he is only complete when he has a relation to these things.
But a myth is a story which, to those who told it and who heard it, was a believable story and a real event that actually took place. But it is, in fact, an exemplary story. It illustrates or exemplifies essential factors in human existence, or it accounts for things like the creation of the world or of certain human situations, but told in the form of a story.
Mythology is not only tribal, foreign and primitive. The Arthurian legends survive in Britain, and when in England to see Godwin Baines, Jung and his wife made a point of visiting Glastonbury, one of the most evocative sites of Arthurian mythology. Count Nikolai Tolstoy.
It is a British myth. It's the matter of Britain, as they call it, but it was called the matter of Britain on a continent, and it has been accepted the world over. You could almost call it the myth. And I suppose because it fulfills so many archetypal patterns, and Arthur, of course, is the archetypal king. He later became a figure who was believed to be sleeping beneath a mountain in a cavern surrounded by his knights, to be called again in the hour of need. Well, there again, the idea of retiring into the heart of the mountain and living on there, as I'm sure, this descent back into the unconscious.
Many visitors today are drawn to a site which has only vague mythological connections. Underneath Glastonbury Tor, legend has it that the Holy Grail is buried, the object of the constant quest of King Arthur and his knights.
It is fascinating that these places draw people, and they don't just draw them because they're beautiful. I mean, the Tor is very striking, but it's the strikingness, I think, which is probably the key. It looks different, it feels different, and that's how it occurred to early peoples, and so they invested it with this numinous quality.
Tintagel Castle in Cornwall is Arthur's supposed birthplace, where Merlin discovered the infant king-to-be washed up on the shore.
In the case of Tintagel, there isn't really any very good evidence to link it to the story of Arthur. The fact is that people simply do invest these places with a numinous quality without knowing, and it's not necessary really, to know the true story of what lies behind it. In a sense, you can say the facts are dispensable. There must, one would suspect, be a need, and that is certainly the case with myth, that all societies, certainly up until quite recently, lived by myths, and we have our own, maybe distorted myths, and where we don't have them, probably our state reflects that.
If you break up a tribe, they lose their religious ideas, the treasure of their old traditions, and they feel out of form completely. They lose their raison d'etre. All the meaning goes out of their life. It does not make sense anymore, because we infect them with our own insanity.
Traditional tribal people understand the importance of retaining their religions and staying close to their myth. Jung recognized Mountain Lake's idea that the Pueblo Indians think with the heart as a source of psychological health. In eastern Arizona, the Navajo Indians have their reservation. Their religion is based on a system of healing ceremonies or chants intended to cure illness or to bring members of the tribe back into harmony with the tribal traditions. Sand paintings illustrate the stories and symbolism of tribal mythology, created by hand with naturally colored sands. Many Jungian psychologists have followed Jung's footsteps to visit the Indians of New Mexico and Arizona. For Donald Sandner, the interest is in the Navajos. For 15 years, he has studied their ceremonies and drawn certain parallels with Jungian psychology.
You could say that in the Navajo system, there is a myth behind every chant, and behind each chant, there was a story. And if you had a certain illness, for instance, let's say you had what they would call joint pain, swelling, arthritis, or rheumatism, that you would say, what hero or what heroine, some of them are women, the heroines of the story, what heroine had that disease? So you might say, that I identify. You would be identifying already with her. So you would choose that chant.
The chant is a recitation of part of one of the epic mythological stories about the gods and the early history of the tribe, and the sand paintings in the ceremony illustrate the story symbolically.
But then the patient comes in and he identifies by sitting on some part of the sand painting. He identifies with that power in the sand painting. And it would be roughly paralleling the myth, although the myth is not told, is never told. It's assumed that you know it already. And that power is put on the patient. And at that moment, the patient takes it in. He identifies with the medicine man, with the power in the painting, and with the hero or heroine of the whole chant. And he himself inwardly goes through that process of being healed by that identification. In the Navajo, they say that if the patient doesn't believe and actively, he has to not only believe, but actively concentrate on what's going on.
The patient wanted to get well. See, he wanted to get back on his feet, and that's what it is. So it's up to the patient, you know.
He has to, the symbolism, the images have to enter his mind and there activate that unconscious part of his mind. And he has to do that. And in the Jungian analysis also, it's the patient. If there are no dreams, we can work with other things, but the patient must produce the symbolism in order for it to be worked on.
Some symbols recur in almost every sand painting. Lightning flashes, rainbows, and the warrior gods and star gods are the most common. They are found in many different cultures, and Jung recognized these symbolic strands as archetypes. The rich Navajo symbolism is not confined to healing chants and rituals. It is also used for the decoration of the Navajo arts and crafts. Zonnie Jones weaves rugs which are replicas of the sand paintings in healing ceremonies.
I mean, if you want the kind of a place to look for corroboration of a lot of Jung's views, particularly the ones about archetypes and the collective unconscious, you could do no better than to look into like the Navajo symbol system, where it's all there. It's all put together from the collective unconscious.
It's a traditional design handed down to me from my mother. There will be a sun and a moon here. I know what the finished rug will look like without having any plan of it on paper. There will be 4 gods like this one here. This is the lightning. And this is the rainbow around the edge.
One symbol that appears constantly across cultures, in religion, mythology, and dreams, is the serpent or snake.
In Navajo painting, the snake appears in a great many of the chants. The great majority of them have the snake in it somewhere, and this is also true of people's dreams. In a lengthy analysis, there's almost always very important dreams that center around the snake.
Once I had a patient, a young woman, about 27 or 8, and her first words were, when I had treated her, she said, "You know, doctor, I come to you because I have a snake in my abdomen." I said, "What?" She said, "Yes, a snake. A black snake coiled up right in the bottom of my abdomen." And I must have made a rather bewildered face at her. And she said, "You know, I don't mean it literally, but I should say it was a snake. It was a snake." Well, now, that is a collective symbol. That is not an individual fantasy. That is a collective fantasy.
A collective, yes.
That is well known in India.
Yes.
For instance, it has nothing to do with India, but we have it too. It was generally human, but it's entirely unknown. So that I, even in the first moment, thought perhaps she's crazy, but she was only highly intuitive. It is in India known. It is the basis of a whole philosophical system of Tantrism. This is Kundalini. Kundalini serpent.
I see.
You see? And that is something known to some few specialists. Generally, it's not known that we have a serpent in the abdomen.
Yeah, yeah.
But that is a collective, you see? That is a collective dream or a collective fantasy. Yeah.
Well, the snake is one of the best symbols of the unconscious itself, because it seems so far away from human consciousness and feeling. It seems to have an autonomous life of its own, and therefore it inspires fear, but at the same time it inspires curiosity and a kind of beauty that relates it to the possibility of a sort of earth wisdom.
So Jung thought it represented the kind of lower nervous system, the spine and the lower parts of the brain stem, so that was the snake, that deep, unconscious, cold, sort of inhuman power that governs us, even when we don't know it.
The serpent is wise only because it doesn't close its eyes. You know, they have no eyelids, so that they can't close their eyes. They seem to be eternally awake and aware. And by projection, man might think that he could also acquire that kind of awareness.
The symbol itself, such as these things we've been talking about, these snakes, these animals, these things you dream about, have a power of their own that can be healing.
Besides his travels and scholarly research, Jung's true work was the healing of his patients in his house on the lake at Kusnacht. Jung left no case notes of the patients he saw for analysis, but at the Jung Institute in Kusnacht there is a large collection of the paintings which he encouraged his patients to produce, extending and illustrating the dream images of their unconscious. Michael Edwards is the curator of the archive.
The clue to the healing, or the way into the work, was really through the imagination, and so he would encourage his patients to amplify and make more of their material, because the unconscious seems to work in images. It's if that's the language of the unconscious, and therefore for the person consciously to work with their images in a spontaneous way would put them in touch with themselves.
Whether in single images produced by patients or whole series of paintings, parallels with sand paintings and other mythological or religious images can be seen. The symbols individually have force, and the patient creates a mythological narrative in pictures.
I think I have certainly learnt from Jung that the role of the image, even if it's an image as imagined, that it has an authority, that the image is not something simply in order to make a clever psychological diagnosis and then throw it away, but the image has power and value of its own. Jung believed, as I understand it, that the story was purposive, that it knew where it was going in its own way. It didn't follow a rational logic, but in the same way that a good novel keeps us interested by taking twists and turns and yet having a sense of being convincing about it. So these inner stories, these private stories, also I think had that same feeling of inevitability, which I think is archetypal.
At his tower on the lake at Bowlingham, Jung produced images and mythological symbols as his patients did. He painted, sculpted, and carved the most important characters and images from his inner life. His travels had confirmed his views that in more primitive societies, myths and archetypes still had a force. In Europe, mythology was no longer a living influence. Dr. Gerhard Adler.
Most of all, in his journey, both to Pueblos and to the Goonies, he learned to look at the Europeans, Europeans, as a white man, we may say, as from outside. And he saw that this was quite wrong to believe that the white man had all the truth.
Today, the idea that man does not have all the truths or all the answers seems commonplace. Jung looked to man's lost psychic origins to restore some balance. However, some Jungian analysts now argue that we are still ruled by myth, but by a new myth, and we are unaware of the fact. Analyst James Hillman.
Yes, the modern man had lost his myth, had lost his sense of myth. But you see, we've moved that. Now we realize that technology is our myth. The myth is always the thing you're in and don't know it's a myth.
Mythology is always present. It's like asking, is matter present in today's world? Yes, of course.
See, science is man's current authority. It's the one thing that is believable now. It's our reality, and we can't escape that.
A much more difficult thing to say, and antagonistic to many ears, is that science is our present myth. Science is our as-if.
Has science replaced religion in that sense?
Yes. For most people, Science is their religion.
The same thing applies to science fiction. It's a modern mythology. And I think it's safe to say that science fiction, in all its various forms and variations, does have one basic recurring theme. It's the theme of extraterrestrial intelligence in one form or another. It has a multitude of forms it can take, but that's the basic idea. And that's highly significant psychologically, because it demonstrates that the second center of the psyche, the self, is all ready to be discovered.
For San Francisco analyst John Beebe, the massive appeal of science fiction films like the Star Wars trilogy comes from combining the archetypal fantasy of extraterrestrial life with characters which represent our own contemporary culture.
I'm not gonna let something tear it apart.
To me, the movie comes alive because it has so many of the elements of our culture all scattered around through it.
Still out there. I don't think it's wise. I'm trying to discuss this in committee. I am not a committee.
The princess is a little bit like a rather pert but very nevertheless American women's lib kind of princess. And then of course we have the R2-D2 and the butler as a kind of Laurel and Hardy, and of course we have the Cowardly Lion. And young, kind of sparky, spanking clean young hero questing kind of. You have the wise old man, and you have all these loose archetypes of the culture. To see myth as something that's happening all the time, that myths are being made all the time, so that it's sort of interesting when a movie becomes not a kind of updated depiction of an old myth, but creates its own new myth.
As we send our spacecraft beyond the solar system, carrying coded communications from the human planet, perhaps science fiction expresses the idea that humankind cannot, after all, rely on the intellectual, conscious life alone. Analyst James Hillman sums up Jung's travels as a way of learning through first-hand experience what the European psyche had allowed to become hidden.
Remember, always Jung has a theory in his actions. And the theory was that the cultural overlay disguises archetypes more than it reveals them. That was part of what Jung was doing with his travels. And there's no doubt that it's you see things you don't see in our ordinary culture.
Old Mountain Lake said to me, "We are the people who live on the roof of the world. We are the sons of the sun, who is our father. We help him daily to rise and to cross over the sky. We do this not only for ourselves, but for the Americans also." He correctly assumes that their day, their light, their consciousness, and their meaning will die when destroyed by the narrow-mindedness of American rationalism. And the same will happen to the whole world when subjected to such treatment.
We've lost certain ancient myths or connection to the world as mythical, but we're still living myths. We can't ever step outside of a myth. We're in one now. We're in one in television as a myth. We're in one, and it carries us as whatever we're doing. And to declare myth only something that people tell each other around the campfire, or dance naked to, or paint themselves purple, that's not the whole story of myth. Myth is what captures your imagination and moves your language and your body into doing things in certain ways. So we're always in myth.
In Africa, New Mexico, England and Switzerland, Jung's discovery of the collective unconscious unites humanity at an instinctual, mythical, imaginative level. What he intuitively knew, and confirmed among African tribes and on a Pueblo rooftop, conscious life is constantly forgetting.
My dear friend, Mountain Lake, are your young men still worshipping the Father Sun? I am busy exploring the truth in which Indians believe. It always impressed me as a great truth, but one hears so little about it. All you tell me about religion is good news to me. There are no interesting religious things over here, only remnants of old things. I was glad to hear that you are in better health than when I saw you. I'm sure your tribe needs you very much, and I wish that you will live still many years. As ever, your friend, C.G. Jung.